Here we'll talk about epidemic. It comes under the time distribution. Under the time distribution, you have three things. One is the short-term fluctuations, periodic fluctuations, and the long-term fluctuations. So under the short-term fluctuations, you'll get this epidemic, right? So epidemic is unusual occurrence of the cases, which is more than expected, right? So you are getting more than expected number of cases in a particular period of time. That is epidemic. So in the definition, you have to remember three words. One is occurrence, second is the cases, and third is the normal expectancy. So where is it occurring? In the community, right? So the occurrence in the community or the region. So what occurrence? Occurrence of cases, right? So of cases of illness or any other health related events clearly in the excess of normal expectancy. So in the definition, you are going to write occurrence, cases, and normal expectancy. So occurrence in the community of the cases of illness clearly in excess of normal expectancy is the definition of epidemic. Coming to the types of epidemic, you have three types. One is a common source epidemic, under which you have again two types. One is single exposure or the multiple exposure. In the propagated, you have three types. One is a person-to-person, arthropod vector, and the animal reservoir. I remembered it using this propagated word. So the two P's indicate person-to-person epidemic, and A indicates arthropod vector and the other A indicates animal reservoir. And the third type of epidemic is slow or the modern epidemic. So coming to the epidemic curve, it is a graphical representation of time distribution of epidemic cases. Because we are reading this epidemic under the time distribution, that too in the short-term fluctuations, right? So even in the graph, you will represent about the time distribution of this epidemic cases. So the graph may suggest the time relationship, duration, seasonal pattern of the disease, source of the infection, and the spread of the disease. So let us see the different types of epidemics. One is a common source single exposure. So in this, just remember the word single, right? So here you will be having this point source or the brief exposure or the single exposure, and there is only one peak. So you can see only one peak. This rise and fall of cases are seen within this one peak, and clustering of cases are seen within the narrow period of time. Because of the brief exposure, the time period is very narrow. Within the narrow period of time itself, you will be seeing this clustering of cases. So using this word single, you will be remembering this single exposure or the brief exposure, and one peak, and also one incubation period, right? And within this one peak, you will be seeing this clustering of cases within a narrow period of time because of the brief exposure. So write about all these points, and the examples include this Bhopal grass tragedy and Minimata disease in the Japan. Coming to the multiple exposure, so just write the opposite of the first thing. Here you will be having single exposure, here you will be having multiple exposure, right? Here you will be having this point source or the brief exposure. Here you will be having this repeated or the continuous exposure. And in the single exposure, you have one peak and the one incubation period. Here you have more than one incubation period or beyond the range of one incubation period. And also there you have this one peak, right? Here you will be having extended or the irregular graph. So even in the graph, you can see you do not have this peak or anything. You just have this extended or the irregular graph, right? So exposure over the long period of time. So examples, prostitutes spreading this gonorrhea, polio vaccine, and also cholera from the pump, right? So here you do not see any explosive rise in the cases. And coming to the propagated, you will be having this person-to-person, arthropod vector, and the animal reservoir, right? So gradual rise and tail off slowly. So the graph is gradually rising and tailing off slowly. The speed of the recovery depends upon this herd immunity, secondary attack rate, and the opportunities of the contact. So example of this person-to-person spread is hepatitis A, arthropod vector is plague, and animal reservoir is Ebola. So coming to the slow and the modern epidemics, you will be having this diabetes mellitus and the hypertension. So if we summarize the whole thing, so first under the time distribution, that to the short-term fluctuations, you will be having this epidemic. So under the definition, you have to remember three things. One is occurrence, second is the case, and third is a normal expectancy. So occurrence in the community of the cases of illness, which is clearly in excess of normal expectancy. So in the epidemic, you will be seeing unusual number of cases more than expected, right? So the types, three types: common source, propagated, slow or the modern. Under the slow or the modern epidemics, you will be seeing this diabetes mellitus and the hypertension, because recent days every other person in the household will be having this hypertension or the diabetes, right? So this is a slow or the modern day epidemic. And coming to the common source, you will be having single exposure, multiple exposure, and propagated. Again, you have P to P, so person to person. A is animal reservoir and other A is arthropod vector. So if you see the epidemic curve, it just represents the time distribution of this epidemic cases. By this curve, you can also learn about this time relationship, duration, seasonal pattern, source, and spread of disease. So under this common source single exposure, just remember the number single or the one, right? So single exposure, brief exposure, and one peak and one incubation period. Then draw the graph. Here you will be having this exposure, you will be seeing this peak. So under this peak you will be seeing this clustering of cases within a narrow period of time. This narrow period of time is because it suggests this brief exposure, right? Rise and fall of the graph is seen, no secondary waves are seen. So write about all of these things, and examples include Bhopal gas tragedy and the Minimata disease. So now write about this multiple exposure. So just write the opposite of it. Here you will be having single exposure, here you will be having multiple exposure. And here you will be having this point source or the brief exposure. Here you will be having repeated or the continuous exposure. There is one peak, here extended or the irregular graph. And here you will be having one incubation period. Here beyond the range of one incubation period, and there you can see this clustering of cases in a narrow period of time. Here you do not see any clustering of cases or anything. Here you just see this extended or the irregular graph with no peaks or no falls, right? So examples include this prostitute spreading gonorrhea, polio vaccine, and also cholera. And if you see this propagated type, there is gradual rise and the tail off slowly, right? So just draw this graph. There is gradual rise and it tails off slowly. So speed of the recovery again depends upon this herd immunity, secondary attack rate, and opportunistics of this contact. So person to person, hepatitis A, arthropod vector plague, and animal reservoir Ebola. So coming to the slow and the modern epidemics, you have diabetes and the hypertension. You can see number of cases nowadays of this diabetes and hypertension. Bye.